My beloved child. A quiet mistake has a strange way of believing silence will protect it forever. And that is where this story begins, not with a confrontation, not with a dramatic confession, but with one tiny detail the second party never expected anyone to notice. For a long time, he had been moving as though certain conversations would remain hidden, certain choices would never connect, and certain contradictions would simply disappear beneath the ordinary rhythm of life. He thought nobody would ever find out. He was wrong. But don't skip, because what exposed him was not what anyone would have predicted. It wasn't some grand investigation. It wasn't someone searching desperately for answers. The truth began surfacing almost by itself, one small piece at a time, until the person at the center of this story could no longer look away. And strangely, your name was already connected to the reason those pieces suddenly mattered. There had been a shift that was almost impossible to describe. The person you care about had started noticing things differently. Words that once sounded convincing suddenly felt incomplete. Explanations that had been accepted without question began leaving behind small unanswered spaces. Nothing seemed dramatic enough to challenge immediately, yet something inside them kept whispering that the picture they had been given did not completely match what they were seeing. Have you ever experienced that strange moment when nothing around you has visibly changed, yet your understanding of everything begins changing? That was happening here. They weren't searching for trouble. They weren't trying to prove anyone wrong. They were simply becoming more attentive, and sometimes attention reveals what assumption has been hiding. The second party did not recognize this change at first. He still believed the old version of the situation existed, the version where nobody compared details, nobody remembered exact words, and nobody asked why two different explanations seemed to describe the same moment differently. His confidence came from familiarity. Things had remained unquestioned for so long that he began mistaking silence for certainty. Yet silence had never meant that nobody noticed. Sometimes people remain quiet because they are gathering understanding without realizing it. Sometimes the heart waits until enough pieces appear before allowing the mind to admit what it already senses. And somewhere inside the person you love, those pieces were beginning to form a pattern. Then came the detail. It looked meaningless at first. A passing reference. A familiar phrase. Something mentioned casually in a conversation that should have ended there. But instead of disappearing, it stayed in their mind. Why had they heard something so similar before? Why did the timing feel familiar? Why did one small detail suddenly contradict something they had previously been told? They tried dismissing it. They genuinely did. Yet several minutes later, their thoughts returned to it. Not because they wanted suspicion, but because the pieces simply refused to fit together anymore. And here is where the story becomes deeply personal. Your presence had already changed the standard by which they understood honesty. Perhaps they never told you that. Perhaps you never realized it. But something about the connection they associate with you had shown them what emotional clarity feels like. Around you, they had experienced moments where they did not need to decode every sentence. They remembered conversations where a simple truth carried more comfort than an elaborate explanation. And without intentionally comparing anyone, they began recognizing the difference between something that feels complicated because life is complicated, and something that feels complicated because important details are missing. That realization stayed with them. Meanwhile, the second party continued behaving as though nothing had shifted. He spoke normally. He carried himself normally. He assumed that because nobody had directly challenged him, nothing had been discovered. But that assumption was becoming his greatest blind spot. The person you care about was no longer listening only to what was being said. They were noticing what changed from one conversation to another. They were remembering details. They were quietly connecting moments that once appeared unrelated. Stay till the end, because one particular connection changed the entire emotional direction of this story. It happened during an ordinary moment. There was no dramatic atmosphere surrounding it. The person you love heard something, perhaps a name, a timeline, or a seemingly harmless explanation, and suddenly remembered an earlier conversation. Their expression changed almost imperceptibly. They didn't react immediately. Instead, they became unusually still. The kind of stillness that appears when the mind has just placed two pieces beside each other and realized they were always connected. They remembered what the second party had said earlier. Then they remembered what had just been revealed. The two versions could not comfortably exist together. For the first time, the question was no longer, "Am I overthinking this?" It became, "Why are these details different?" That question mattered because it opened a door the second party had depended on remaining closed. And yet, there was another surprise. The person you care about did not feel the immediate anger someone might expect. Their first emotion was disappointment, not loud disappointment, but the quiet kind that changes the way you see someone. They began wondering why honesty had seemed so difficult. Why hide something that could have been spoken about openly? Why create confusion when a simple conversation might have prevented all of it? Those questions slowly led somewhere unexpected. They led back to you. Not because you were responsible for what happened. You weren't. But because your memory represented something different in their emotional world. They remembered how carefully you had once handled something vulnerable. They remembered a moment when you could have chosen ambiguity but instead allowed sincerity to speak. Maybe it was something small. Maybe you barely remember it. Yet they remembered. And suddenly they understood why your absence, distance, or silence had felt heavier than they wanted to admit. There are people whose importance becomes clearer only when life shows us the contrast. The second party had unknowingly created that contrast. The person you love began replaying old moments involving you, not obsessively, not dramatically, but with a new understanding. A sentence you once said carried a different meaning now. A reaction they misunderstood suddenly made sense. Even one moment when you pulled back emotionally began looking less like rejection and more like self-respect. That realization reached somewhere deep. What if I misunderstood them? The question appeared quietly. Then another followed. What if they saw something I wasn't ready to see? And then came the question they could not dismiss. What if I trusted the wrong version of this story? Something important is waiting for you here, because the discovery was no longer simply about what the second party had kept hidden. It was becoming a revelation about how that hidden truth had influenced decisions, impressions, and emotions surrounding you. There had been a conversation in the past. The person you care about remembered it clearly now. The second party had said something about you, not necessarily something dramatic, but something positioned carefully enough to influence perception. At the time, it sounded believable. There seemed to be no reason to question it. But with the new inconsistency sitting in front of them, that old conversation suddenly deserved another look. They replayed the wording. Something felt different. Why had the second party been so certain about something he could not have known? Why had he described your intentions as though he had access to your private thoughts? Why had the person you love accepted someone else's interpretation instead of asking you directly? That last question hurt the most. Because now they were beginning to realize that part of the distance between you may not have grown naturally. It may have been shaped by assumptions that were never properly examined. The second party still had no idea this realization was unfolding. He believed the situation remained exactly where he had left it. But the emotional landscape had already changed. The person you love was no longer asking what they should believe about you. They were asking why they had ever allowed another person to define you for them. And that distinction was enormous. A memory surfaced, something you had said long ago. Perhaps you had tried to explain yourself. Perhaps you had chosen silence instead of arguing. Perhaps you simply stepped away when you realized that forcing someone to understand you would only create more confusion. At the time, your response may have seemed mysterious. Now it looked different. Now it looked dignified. They suddenly understood that you might have known more than you ever said. This realization softened something inside them. Instead of thinking, "Why didn't they fight harder for me?" they began thinking, maybe they were protecting their peace. That thought stayed. And then another detail surfaced. This one was harder for the second party to explain. Someone remembered something. Not gossip. Not speculation. Just a simple memory from an earlier moment that accidentally confirmed the timeline. It was mentioned naturally, almost without significance. But the person you love heard it immediately. Their heart did not race with panic. Their mind became clear. Because suddenly there were 3 pieces instead of 2. The earlier statement. The recent contradiction. And now an independent detail connecting them. The pattern was becoming difficult to dismiss. Yet rather than confronting the second party immediately, they chose something more powerful. They waited. Not to create drama. Not to trap anyone. They simply wanted to understand. And during that waiting, something remarkable happened. The second party continued speaking. Sometimes when someone believes nobody knows anything, they reveal more than they intended simply because they feel safe. A new explanation appeared. Then another detail. Each one sounded reasonable by itself. Together, they created a problem. The timeline shifted again. The person you care about noticed. They said very little. But inside, an entire understanding was rearranging itself. That was when the second party finally sensed something had changed. Not because anyone accused him. Because the questions became simpler. Calmer. More precise. Are you sure that happened then? A pause. Yes. Another quiet question. Because I remember you telling me something different. And there it was. The first crack in his confidence. He tried explaining. The explanation sounded almost convincing. Almost. But there are moments when another person's words stop determining what you believe because your own memory has finally become stronger than their version. This was one of those moments. The person you love looked at him differently. Not cruelly. Not angrily. Just clearly. And clarity can change everything without raising its voice. For the first time, the second party realized the secret was no longer completely his to control. Someone knew enough to ask questions. Someone remembered enough to recognize contradictions. And someone was beginning to understand why you had behaved the way you did. But the deepest discovery had not arrived yet. That came when the person you care about returned to something from the past and noticed one detail everyone had overlooked. Your reaction. They remembered exactly how you responded when the situation first began becoming complicated. You had not tried to destroy anyone's reputation. You had not tried to force yourself into the center of the story. You had simply changed your energy. You became quieter. More careful. Perhaps more distant. At the time, they interpreted that distance incorrectly. Now they wondered whether your silence had been telling them something words never could. Maybe you had sensed the contradiction before anyone else. Maybe you had seen behavior that did not align. Maybe you simply knew that if someone truly wanted clarity, they eventually had to discover it themselves. That possibility landed heavily. Because suddenly your distance no longer looked like indifference. It looked like someone refusing to participate in confusion. And the person you love respected that more than they expected. For a while, they sat with this realization privately. No messages. No immediate decisions. Just thought. Their mind moved backward through conversations they had almost forgotten, and with every memory, one question became stronger. How much did I misunderstand? This is where the emotional center of the story quietly shifted. It was no longer primarily about the second party. It was becoming about the truth between you and the person you care about. The hidden detail had opened a door, but behind that door was something far more meaningful: the possibility that feelings had been interpreted through information that was never completely reliable. And once someone realizes that, they naturally begin revisiting everything. The moments they thought you did not care. The times they assumed your silence meant you had moved on. The occasions when they believed someone else understood you better than they did. One by one, those assumptions began losing their certainty. And underneath them, something remained. A feeling they had never fully erased. Your memory. It returned differently now. Warmer. Clearer. Less complicated. There was no need to romanticize what happened. There were still unanswered questions. There were still conversations that needed honesty. But something inside them had changed from defensiveness to curiosity. What would they tell me if I actually asked? That question was about you. And it was the first time in a long while they allowed themselves to consider hearing your side without anyone else interpreting it first. The second party noticed the emotional distance almost immediately. He tried filling the silence. But the more he explained, the more the person you care about recognized something subtle. Truth usually becomes clearer when explained, while an unstable story often becomes more complicated. So they stopped chasing explanations. They began trusting observation. And strangely, that brought peace. Because clarity does not always arrive as a dramatic revelation. Sometimes clarity is simply the moment you stop forcing mismatched pieces together. That evening, the person you care about returned to one final detail. A message. Not necessarily a new message. An older one. Something connected to you that they had once read through the lens of what someone else had told them. They opened it again. This time, they read your words without that influence. And the meaning changed. A sentence they once considered cold now sounded hurt. A phrase they thought was distant now sounded careful. A goodbye they assumed was final suddenly sounded like someone leaving the door open without sacrificing dignity. They read it twice. Then once more. And something inside them softened. Because the second party's hidden truth had accidentally exposed another truth. They had never fully heard you. Not without outside voices. Not without assumptions. Not without someone else's version standing between your words and their heart. Until now. They placed the message down. Silence filled the room. And in that silence, your name carried a completely different weight. There was still one missing piece. One detail capable of explaining why the second party had been so determined to keep everything from being connected. The person you love did not know it yet. But they were closer than they realized. Because while they were rereading your old words, someone else was remembering a conversation the second party desperately hoped had been forgotten. And when that conversation comes back into the story, the question will no longer be whether something was hidden. The question will be why your name was involved in it at all. The forgotten conversation returned in the most ordinary way possible, and that was precisely why nobody was prepared for what it revealed. There was no dramatic announcement, no carefully planned confrontation, no person arriving with a perfect explanation. It surfaced because someone casually remembered a sentence the second party had spoken weeks earlier, a sentence that seemed meaningless at the time, but now carried an entirely different weight. The person you care about heard it and became still. Not shocked. Not angry. Just deeply attentive. Because the sentence contained one detail that should never have matched the timeline they had recently uncovered. Yet it did. Perfectly. And suddenly, the question they had been quietly carrying changed. They were no longer wondering whether the second party had simply remembered something incorrectly. They were beginning to wonder whether he had known far more from the beginning than he ever admitted. Don't skip this part, because what followed did not merely reveal another contradiction. It changed how the person you love understood the entire distance that had formed between you. The memory concerned a conversation about you. Your name had come up casually, but the second party's response had been unusually specific. At the time, nobody thought much about it. People sometimes speak confidently. People sometimes make assumptions. But now the person you care about remembered the exact wording and noticed something they had completely overlooked before. The second party had described an event involving you before he should reasonably have known about it. That realization settled slowly. They replayed the sequence. When had that conversation happened? When had the second party supposedly learned the information? And why did those two moments no longer line up? They did not immediately assume the worst. They searched for an innocent explanation first. Perhaps the dates were being remembered incorrectly. Perhaps someone else had mentioned it. Perhaps there was a perfectly reasonable connection nobody remembered. That possibility mattered because the person you care about wanted truth, not drama. But the more carefully they reconstructed the sequence, the less comfortable the explanation became. There was a gap, and inside that gap sat a question nobody had asked before: how did he know? A strange calm came over them after that. Sometimes the deepest realization does not create noise. Sometimes it removes noise. For weeks, perhaps longer, they had been trying to understand why certain things surrounding you never felt completely settled. Why one conversation contradicted another. Why their feelings about you had shifted after hearing information from someone else. Why they had reacted to situations they never personally witnessed. Suddenly, those disconnected moments began standing beside one another. And when they did, the person you care about recognized something painful but useful: they had allowed second-hand interpretations to influence first-hand feelings. They knew how they felt around you. They knew what your presence had meant. They knew the conversations the two of you had actually shared. Yet somewhere along the way, those direct experiences had become crowded by what someone else claimed you meant, what someone else believed you wanted, and what someone else suggested you were doing. Now they were asking themselves why. The answer was not immediate. That mattered. Because this story was never going to become meaningful through one enormous revelation. It was happening through smaller truths, each removing another layer of confusion. The second party had apparently positioned himself as someone who understood the situation. He always seemed to have an interpretation ready. If you became quiet, he had a reason for your silence. If you stepped away, he had an explanation for your distance. If you said something ambiguous, he somehow knew exactly what you really meant. The person you love had never questioned why one individual seemed so certain about emotions that belonged to you. But now they did. How could anyone know your intentions without asking you? How could someone confidently describe what was inside your heart? Why had those interpretations always seemed to point in the same direction away from direct communication with you? That last question lingered longer than the others. Away from direct communication. They thought about it again. Every time there had been an opportunity for clarity between you, somehow another interpretation had appeared first. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it wasn't. But the person you care about finally understood something important. Regardless of the second party's intentions, they should have asked you directly. That realization was not about blaming someone else for every misunderstanding. It was about taking responsibility for allowing another voice to become louder than the person actually involved. And surprisingly, that responsibility made them think of you with even greater tenderness. Because they remembered moments when you had tried to communicate without attacking anyone. Moments when you seemed to be choosing your words carefully. Moments when perhaps you realized you were being misunderstood but refused to turn the situation into a battle. Why didn't I ask them? The thought arrived again. This time it hurt differently. Not because the past could be rewritten, but because the answer was so simple. They had believed they already knew. And now they understood how dangerous certainty can become when it is built on incomplete information. The second party, meanwhile, still believed he could smooth everything over. He had sensed the change, certainly. The questions were different. The person you care about no longer accepted every explanation immediately. But he seemed to believe that enough time would make the curiosity disappear. So he behaved normally. Perhaps too normally. He returned to familiar subjects. He tried creating the impression that nothing significant had happened. Yet something had happened, even if nobody could see it from outside. Trust had shifted. Not vanished. Not shattered dramatically. Simply shifted. And once trust moves even slightly, every new statement lands differently. Then came another conversation. This one almost passed unnoticed. Someone mentioned that the second party had contacted them during a period when he had previously claimed to be somewhere else. Nothing inappropriate was implied. Nothing extreme had happened. The significance was entirely in the timing. The person you care about heard the date and immediately remembered the earlier explanation. Again, two pieces did not fit. They asked one calm question. What time was that? The answer came naturally. And there it was. Another mismatch. The second party was not present when the question was asked, which gave the person you love space to process what they had learned without anyone guiding their reaction. They did something they had not done before. They wrote the details down. Not because they were building a case. Because they were tired of doubting their own memory. A date. A conversation. A phrase. Another date. A different explanation. Your name. A message. A moment when communication between you suddenly changed. Placed separately, each detail looked harmless. Placed together, they told a story. And somewhere near the center of that story was the period when the person you care about had begun pulling away from you. That discovery created the first real emotional peak. They looked at the sequence and realized the timing was almost exact. The second party had begun speaking more frequently about you shortly before the distance grew. Not after. Before. That distinction changed everything. Stay till the end, because what they remembered next explained why this mattered so much. There had been one particular day when the person you care about had wanted to contact you. They remembered holding their phone, considering what to say, perhaps even beginning a message. There was something unresolved between you, and part of them wanted clarity. But before they reached out, they had a conversation with the second party. They remembered the advice now. Give them space. Perfectly reasonable words. Nothing suspicious about them. But then another sentence followed. If they wanted to talk, they would have already reached out. Again, reasonable on the surface. So they waited. And perhaps you were waiting too. The person you care about stared at that memory for a long time. What if both of you had been waiting? What if your silence had not meant rejection? What if you believed they had chosen distance while they believed you had chosen distance? Neither person needed to be a villain for that misunderstanding to grow. Sometimes all it takes is hesitation, pride, imperfect timing, and one confident outside interpretation. But now there was another detail. The second party had apparently known you had considered reaching out. That information surfaced unexpectedly through the forgotten conversation. Someone remembered him saying something like, "It doesn't matter if they message." The person you care about froze internally. If? Not when. Not after. If. Why would he have been discussing the possibility of a message from you unless he knew communication between you was still possible? More importantly, why had he been so invested in what happened if you reached out? The person you loved did not jump to conclusions. They resisted that temptation. They understood that memories are imperfect and sentences can lose context over time. So rather than deciding what the second party intended, they focused on what could actually be known. They had been influenced. That much was clear. They had relied too heavily on another person's interpretation. That was undeniable. And they had never properly heard your perspective. That was the part they could change. Suddenly the story stopped being about discovering someone else's secret. It became about correcting their own mistake. Something softened inside them when they understood this. Because blame keeps people trapped in the past. Responsibility creates a path forward. They could not control what the second party had said. They could control what happened next. For the first time, they considered contacting you without discussing it with anyone else first. No advice. No interpretations. No asking someone what they thought you might say. Just two people speaking directly. The idea frightened them slightly, not because they feared you, but because direct truth leaves nowhere for assumptions to hide. What would you say? Would you be surprised? Would you still care enough to answer? Would you ask why it had taken so long? Would you tell them something they should have understood months ago? Those questions remained unanswered. Yet beneath them was another emotion they had not expected. Relief. The possibility of finally hearing you directly felt relieving. They opened your old conversation again. Scrolled. Stopped. Read. There was a sentence they had overlooked earlier. Nothing poetic. Nothing dramatic. Just honest. You had once made it clear that you did not want confusion between you. At the time, they had read the sentence defensively. They thought perhaps you were creating distance. Now, without the second party's interpretation surrounding it, they saw something entirely different. You had been asking for clarity. They had mistaken clarity for withdrawal. That realization was difficult. They leaned back and allowed the memory to settle. Another moment came back to them, your response after they became distant. You did not chase endlessly. You did not create chaos. You seemed to respect the space they had created, even if that space hurt you. And now they understood why. You may have believed the decision was theirs. Meanwhile, they had believed the decision was yours. Two people interpreting the same silence in opposite ways. Something important is waiting for you here, because this is where the person you love stopped viewing the past as a closed story. Maybe it had not ended. Maybe it had simply stopped in the middle of a misunderstanding. That possibility did not guarantee anything. They knew that. Time changes people. Feelings evolve. Life moves. But for the first time, they allowed themselves to acknowledge that the truth deserved a conversation, even if the outcome could not be predicted. And strangely, that was enough to bring peace. The second party noticed the change the next time they spoke. His explanations were met with shorter responses. Not hostile. Just thoughtful. Then he asked the question that revealed more than he intended. Have you been talking to them? The person you care about looked up. Them. You. There had been no mention of you in the conversation. No reason for him to bring you up. Yet he did. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The second party seemed to realize his mistake almost immediately. He tried making the question sound casual. I was just wondering. But the person you love had heard something beneath the words. Concern. Not necessarily fear. Not necessarily guilt. Just concern about whether direct communication between you had resumed. And that created a new question. Why would that matter so much? They answered calmly. No. Why? The second party shrugged. No reason. No reason. Those two words stayed in the room longer than they should have. The conversation moved forward, but the person you care about barely heard the next subject. Their mind had returned to the timeline. The advice not to contact you. The interpretations of your silence. The oddly specific knowledge. The forgotten conversation. And now this spontaneous question about whether you were speaking again. It was becoming harder to treat everything as unrelated. Still, they refused to assume intention. Instead, they decided they needed one thing. Your version. Not because they wanted you to confirm a theory. Because they finally realized your voice had been missing from a story about you. Later, alone, they opened the place where they could contact you. Your name appeared. For a moment, they simply stared at it. Their thumb hovered. They started writing. Deleted it. Started again. Can we talk? Too abrupt. Deleted. I've been thinking about something. Too vague. Delete it again. They smiled faintly at themselves because suddenly every sentence seemed inadequate. How do you begin a conversation that should perhaps have happened long ago? Then they stopped trying to create the perfect opening. They wrote something simple. Something honest. But they did not send it. Not yet. Because just as they were about to, another message appeared on their phone. It was not from you. It was from the person who had remembered the earlier conversation. And the message contained one additional detail. A detail about what the second party had said immediately after your name came up. The person you love read the message once. Then again. Their expression changed. Because the sentence did not merely suggest that the second party knew more than he admitted. It revealed that he had expected you to contact them. He had apparently said, long before anyone became suspicious. They'll probably try to explain everything eventually. Eventually. Explain everything. The person you care about stared at those words. How could the second party know there was something for you to explain if, according to his original story, he barely understood what had happened himself? That was the contradiction they could no longer overlook. But something even more meaningful emerged from it. Maybe you had never been the confusing one. Maybe you had been trying to find the right moment to tell your side while the person you cared about had already been persuaded that your explanation would not matter. They looked back at the unfinished message they had written to you. The words suddenly felt different. This time, they did not delete them. Yet their fingers still hovered over the screen. Because another memory had just surfaced, one involving the exact day everything between you changed. And hidden inside that memory was a sentence the second party had told them never came from you. Except now, for the first time, they had reason to believe that it did.